Tim Woody left his teenage sister Kacie at home while he headed off to the college library to do some research. The whole while, Kacie stayed at home on her computer, chatting away with her friends on Yahoo Messenger, and time passed by in the blink of an eye. Tim got home at about 10 p.m., but as he opened the front door, he was met by eerie silence. Normally he'd hear Kacie typing or giggling in the next room over, but not this time. The silence was so heavy, you could feel it. Tim looked around the house, wondering if Kacie may have headed off to bed early, but she hadn't. And Tim quickly realized the house was completely empty. The computer was on, but Kacie was nowhere to be found. As Tim started looking around, he found Kacie's glasses tossed onto the floor, completely smashed. As if things weren't unsettling already, the family dog soon came running in. But running is an overstatement. The poor dog could hardly walk. It was limping in pain and whimpering, as if it was trying to tell Tim that something terrible had happened. But Tim already knew. But what he didn't know was where was his sister. Welcome to True Crime Stories. If you're new here, I'm your host, Ty Knotts, and I post new true crime documentaries every single week, narrated by a real human person. So if that's your kind of thing, be sure to hit that subscribe button to keep up to date with all my future cases. Kacie Woody was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, to parents Rick and Christy Woody. She had two older brothers, Austin and Tim. Growing up, Kacie was defined as a kind and caring girl who loved poetry, singing, and dancing. She also loved to play the saxophone. She loved animals too, as do most people, but there was one type of animal Kacie didn't like: horses. It turned out there was a story behind her dislike of horses. In June of 1997, when Kacie was just 7 years old, her family got into a car accident. They were en route to Tim's baseball game when a bunch of horses were set loose on the road, and it caused Rick, her father, to swerve. As a result of that, they collided with an oncoming horse, and Kacie's mom, Christy, tragically lost her life right then and there. Rick also suffered from a lot of injuries, but luckily he pulled through. Ever since her mom's passing, Kacie jumped into poetry and would dedicate countless poems to her mom. The memory of this left Kacie with a serious distaste for horses, but that tragedy didn't fade her shine forever. At the time of the case, Kacie, Rick, Tim, Austin, and Tim's friend Eric all lived in a house in Holland, Arkansas, whereas Kacie's aunt, Teresa, was the Woody's family's next-door neighbor, helping take up that motherly gap that Christy had so tragically left behind. Funny enough, the Woody family lived in a heavily wooded area in Arkansas, and even though Kacie was still too young to use the internet unsupervised, her dad allowed her to use instant messaging on the family's computer. See, where they lived, outgoing calls were billed as long distance, which meant that the Woody phone bill was often incredibly expensive. This was why the family often kept in touch through instant messages to update each other. Kacie had an account on Yahoo Messenger by the name of Model Behavior 36. She would regularly chat with her family and friends on Yahoo, and she also registered on several Christian chat rooms to find friends because she thought it was safer. Somewhere between 2001 and 2002, it's assumed that Kacie stumbled across another user on Yahoo by the name of Dave Fagan. His username on Yahoo was JazzmanDF, and he was a young boy from California who loved surfing. Well, as soon as Kacie and Dave exchanged messages, they developed an online friendship. Dave seemed normal, and he and Kacie shared a lot of the same interests. Kacie eventually began to open up about her personal life, and even told Dave about her mom's passing and how it had affected her. Dave also shared a great deal of personal details, including his aunt, who lived in Arkansas, and her failing health. The two talked for a long time, for many months, and even though Dave sounded a bit too old for Kacie, saying he'd be turning 18 soon, their friendship continued to grow. Before anyone knew it, young Kacie would find herself in her first real relationship, but everything was not what it seemed. Kacie ended up introducing her best friends, Samantha and Jessica, to Dave, and they added each other to their buddy list. For any of you guys that may either be too young to have experienced Yahoo Messenger or maybe too old to have ever cared about it in the first place, Yahoo Messenger was basically the same thing as texting these days, but everything took place on a computer. The best part about the internet in the 90s and early 2000s was that when you were done, you could turn it off and walk away. But these days, it follows you wherever you go. Some people say this is progress, but I'm not personally sure. But anyway, you'd be able to compile a friends list of people where you could just click their name and immediately start up a conversation, assuming that they were at their desk. Dave made his way onto the friend list of Kacie and several of her friends. Well, Jessica and Sam, two of those friends, were pretty protective of Kacie. They tried warning her to not be so open and honest with people that she'd never seen in person before, and falling in love with them or starting a relationship should be a no-go. Samantha and Jessica were scared that someone might take advantage of Kacie's naivety. At that point, they even stressed that strangers on Yahoo could be, quote, 80-year-old grandpas wanting to lure young children into their traps. Kacie took note of this warning, but she didn't stop talking to Dave. Since Kacie's dad, Rick, worked as a police officer, he was out on shifts most of the time and wasn't home to monitor his daughter's internet activity. And even though he knew that Kacie was talking to boys on the computer, he thought that as long as Kacie was at home and the boys were elsewhere, Kacie would be safe from any sort of danger. Kacie's brothers were also in college, so they would usually be on campus attending classes. But there was still Kacie's aunt, Teresa, who lived next door, so Kacie's family was at ease knowing at least she wasn't completely alone. Well, in the summer of 2002, Rick found out that Dave was turning 18, and since Kacie was still very young, he prohibited her from talking to Dave. Kacie obviously rebelled, and somehow she and Dave started talking on the phone. Well, in the autumn of 2002, something strange happened in the Woody household. See, Kacie and her best friend Jessica were spending the night at her place when all of a sudden, the girls started hearing strange noises coming from downstairs as well as outside of the house. They heard the wooden floorboards creaking as if someone was downstairs, but no one was at home besides the girls, at least as far as they knew and hoped. Kacie and Jessica were scared to the bone and barricaded themselves in Kacie's bedroom. Kacie didn't have a landline near her to call her dad or the police, so she reached out to none other than Dave and told him that someone was in their house. Dave, in an attempt to try and calm Kacie down, told her not to worry and that no one was likely in the house. And suddenly, as if Dave's words were magic, the noises stopped completely. This event left Kacie pretty shaken up, but she didn't stop talking to Dave. And actually, Kacie would soon make another online friend right after this incident. In October of 2002, Kacie met another boy on Yahoo Messenger, and he was a 14-year-old boy named Scott. His username was Taz2999, and he was from Alpharetta, Georgia. He loved football and wrestling, and his profile picture was of a teen boy wearing a football uniform. At some point, Scott and Kacie began dating, and this turned into a very confusing situation between Kacie, Dave, and Scott. When Dave found out about Kacie dating Scott, he wasn't angry or betrayed per se, he just requested to remain friends with Kacie because he needed someone to talk to about his aunt, and since Kacie connected with him on a sympathetic and personal level, she agreed to keep in touch. But Kacie didn't heed her friend's warning about not giving personal information to online strangers, and she ended up sharing her home address with Scott. One day, Samantha and Jessica were shocked to find Scott's physical picture, the same picture he had on Yahoo, inside Kacie's locker. They confronted Kacie about this, and she admitted that she'd given her home address to Scott, and he presumably mailed her this photo. Now, I know Kacie is young, and this was back in 2002, but trusting a practical stranger online and giving him her home address was certainly a mistake on Kacie's part, and she certainly knew this, but her love for Scott was overwhelming, and so she tossed caution to the wind and convinced herself that her friends were just being overprotective. This led Samantha to reach out to the school's counselor and unfold the entire scene of Kacie interacting with strangers online and giving out her home address and phone number to these people. Kacie was immediately called into the office and given a crash course on internet safety. This led to a brief argument between Kacie and Samantha, but they eventually made up, and Kacie proceeded to invite Samantha to a sleepover soon after. Samantha actually declined because it was a weekday and she had some things to do. Kacie then asked Jessica, but she was also busy and couldn't make it. Jessica and Samantha did find it weird that Kacie was suggesting a sleepover on a school night. Their gut told them something was up, and their guts were right. On the evening of December 3rd, 2002, Kacie was home alone. Even though Kacie was usually alone since her dad and brothers were out and about, her aunt was right next door and would keep an eye on her. But this time around, Kacie's aunt, Teresa, was also out in Conway for her daughter's baseball game. So Kacie was truly all alone in her home. Computer and landline records showed that Kacie was talking to her online boyfriend, Scott, on Yahoo, whereas she was also in contact with Dave on the phone. At around 9:41 p.m., Scott noticed that Kacie had stopped replying to his messages. The chat room was open, but Kacie was not answering any of her messages. Scott really got worried, and he called the home landline, as well as contacted Kacie's friend, Jessica, via email, but to no avail. Kacie was out of nowhere just ghosting him. A while later, Kacie's brother, Tim, and his friend Eric arrived home, and while Eric assumed that Kacie had just gone to bed and didn't think much of it, Tim was immediately alert when he saw a couple of things. First, Kacie's reading glasses were damaged, and a lens was missing as if someone had smashed it. The computer was open but unattended, and the chat room with Scott was still open. And the most alarming part was the fact that the family dog, a Yorkshire Terrier, was limping and whimpering. Tim immediately called his dad, Rick, and the detectives were quickly involved once Kacie's friends didn't hear anything from her either. The detectives initially thought that Kacie was a runaway, but Rick was quick to rebuff those claims. He told them that he and Kacie had actually talked a few hours before she went missing at about 7 p.m., and Kacie was practicing her saxophone. Moreover, Kacie's clothes, thick coats and shoes were all left behind, so if Kacie wanted to run away, she would have taken at least some warm clothing with her, because at night the temperatures were ruthlessly cold. Soon, the FBI joined the missing person investigation too, and the investigators talked to everyone, Kacie's friends, schoolmates, and even teachers. They wanted to find any clues that could have explained Kacie's disappearance. That's when they got to know about Kacie's online relationships with Scott and Dave, two practical strangers. The detectives were immediately on high alert. They thought that either Scott or Dave had something to do with Kacie's disappearance. First, they were able to track down Scott through his computer activity, and sure enough, he wasn't lying. He was in Georgia, and after a lengthy crackdown, the FBI was able to confirm that Scott was indeed 14 years old, and he wasn't lying to Kacie. So he couldn't have been a threat to her, even though he knew where Kacie lived. So the next person they needed to talk to was this Dave guy, and after going through his and Kacie's chats, they found something out. Dave was actually on his way from California to Arkansas to see his ailing aunt one last time, because she wasn't going to last long. This was taking place sometime right before Kacie went missing. The investigators were highly suspicious of Dave and his sudden trip to Arkansas, and things weren't adding up. The detectives launched a search around the area where they thought Dave was staying, and they were able to pinpoint the location to a motel in Conway at a Motel 6, where a man with a 1993 Buick Regal and a California license plate had arrived a day before Kacie went missing. This man was 47-year-old David Fuller. He'd booked a week's stay in the motel and was complaining non-stop about the internet not working properly. The police then went to the Conway Enterprise rent-a-car from where David recently rented a silver Dodge Caravan minivan, and the employees remembered David being on edge. He was constantly taking smoke breaks while completing the paperwork, and he was just acting oddly. The detectives were later able to get a hold of Dave's contact number, and lo and behold, it was the same number used to contact Kacie on the landline. So the investigators were sure of one thing. There was no 18-year-old Dave Fagan. It was actually 47-year-old David Fuller, pretending to be a teenager, and he was grooming Kacie. But now, she was gone, and Dave was the prime suspect in her disappearance. David Leslie Fuller belonged to a Mormon family of 6. Born in Salt Lake City, Utah, David married a woman at the age of 19 but got divorced shortly after. He then married a woman named Sally in the 80s, and sometime later, she gave birth to 2 children, a son and a daughter, 4 years apart. David started out his work life as a Navy Seabee in 1989, but he left the Navy in 1999 when the family of 4 moved to La Mesa. This was the time when David began to display anger problems and mood swings. He would also subject Sally to abuse, and at one point, Sally caught David spending long hours of the day on the internet, taking late-night walks and talking to someone on the phone. In 2002, Sally and David were considering getting a divorce, and it's safe to say that David was not happy at all. The couple eventually separated, and David just got worse from this point on. He got arrested and charged with spousal abuse when he charged into Sally's home, threatened her, and used force to subdue her, and even managed to attack Sally with a screwdriver, despite the fact that she'd barricaded herself in a bedroom of her home. After all this blew over, David ended up getting a job at a used car dealership, but instead of working, he spent his time on his work computer, watching inappropriate content involving children. It's pretty clear to see at this point, Dave had a serious problem. With all of this information, in search of Kacie, the police focused their attention on a storage unit David had rented. See, David's credit card notified the detectives that he was renting a storage unit at GuardSmart. So the investigators made a beeline for the storage unit, hoping to catch David red-handed and hopefully find Kacie alive and well. But little did they know, they were about to get a lot more than they bargained for. A day following Kacie's disappearance, on December 4th, 2002, Little Rock police arrived at the storage unit at GuardSmart at around 6 p.m. The door was closed, but it was unlocked, so the detectives pulled the rolling door up. And when they did, two things happened at once. First, the police saw the silver Dodge Caravan parked inside the storage unit facing the investigators, and then a second later, a single pop rang through the tense and eerie storage space. Someone had fired a round inside. The officers ran for cover and called for backup, all the while commanding whoever was inside to surrender and come out of the unit. But there was no answer or movement inside that storage unit. Still, the detectives didn't move a muscle, and they waited for SWAT teams to arrive. Finally, over 2 hours later, at around 8:30 p.m., the police and SWAT teams entered the storage unit. But what they saw before them likely haunts them to this day. On the ground, by the still running minivan, lay 47-year-old David Fuller, with a single wound to his head. Clutched in his hand was a 9mm firearm. Next, the detectives went around the minivan, and when they reached the back, they saw something. It was light and pale. They weren't sure what it was, but they soon found out in the back of the van, chained to the corners of the van floor, lay the lifeless body of Kacie Woody. David took her life with that same firearm he'd used on himself, and horrifically, David had done much more to her before her life was taken. This was far, far too much for the detectives to handle. This scene was very, very bad. Next to Kacie's head was a bottle of chloroform and a dirty rag. The investigators suspect that this was how David managed to knock Kacie out and abduct her from her home in Holland, Arkansas. Kacie had been found, but the bigger problem was her life had already been ended, and the killer wouldn't even face the consequences of his actions. Following the discovery of Kacie's body and David's irreversible actions, the FBI got a search warrant for David's apartment, and when they searched the place, it was worse than they had feared. Right by David's computer, there was a collage of Kacie's pictures and a piece of paper that had Kacie, her friends, and their numbers and home addresses on it. It's just so terrifying to think how meticulous this monster was. He planned everything to a T. Investigators also found a poem written by Kacie for her mom in David's possession. Further digging showed that David used his David Fagan persona to not only groom Kacie, but 3 other girls in the past, too. It started in the winter of 2000, when he reached out to a girl in Michigan under the alias Dave Fagan and offered to buy her a plane ticket to California. Thankfully, the girl refused. Otherwise, can you imagine what could have gone down if the poor girl went to California to meet Dave? Next, 2 years after the fact, he targeted a girl in Dallas, Texas, and asked for her home address to send her some flowers. But this plan failed too, because the girl was smart and she never gave her address to him. Kacie, unfortunately, was not so streetwise, and she fell into David's catfishing trap, and it cost her her life. Kacie just wanted a friend, but what she got instead was David Fuller. The investigators also found out this wasn't the first time David had visited Arkansas. After meeting Kacie on Yahoo, he traveled to Arkansas 3 times in the fall of 2002. He arrived at Clinton National Airport, rented a car, and went to a Motel 6 in Conway, and it's alleged that he spied on Kacie during his stay there. This can't be confirmed, though, because David isn't here to speak for himself, but I don't think anyone would be shocked if this was eventually proven to be true. The detectives soon learned that the firearm he used on Kacie and himself was purchased in November of 2002. He told his kids that he was getting a firearm for target practice, which was obviously a lie. He also went to GuardSmart and looked at a large storage unit before renting one. the same one he and Kacie would soon be found in. This was oddly around the same time when Kacie and Jessica heard the mysterious intruders inside her home. Looking back, Jessica and Samantha believed that the intruder was David, but he was unable to carry out his plans, maybe because he knew Kacie wasn't alone or for some other reason. It's also believed he was scoping the area before he put his plans into motion, which is just chilling to think about. This man had successfully made his way into the home of these 3 teenage girls, and he did so largely undetected until the floor creaked, that is. When David returned to California, he bought chains, zip ties, and tape from his local Home Depot, and even got his hands on chloroform from a chemical supply company. In December, he decided to put his plans into action, and when he found out that Kacie would be home alone, he drove from California to Arkansas in his Buick Regal, and he told Kacie he was coming to see his aunt. But spoiler alert, there was no aunt. This was David's sick and twisted way of gaining Kacie's trust. Kacie's funeral was held on December 9th, 6 days after she'd gone missing. She was laid to rest right next to her mother, Christy, in South Crossroads Church Cemetery in Rosebud, Arkansas. Soon after all this unfolded, Kacie's family founded a nonprofit organization called the Kacie Woody Foundation. And the idea behind it was to warn children about internet safety and help them to not fall into the same trap that Kacie did. Rick was so devastated and riddled with guilt that he couldn't protect his daughter from a predator. He thought that as long as Kacie was home, she was safe. But he lost his daughter in the worst way, and still thinks about the what-ifs and whether things could have turned out differently. Kacie's case is quite possibly the first thoroughly documented case of a predator using the internet to groom, abduct, and murder a teen. And it was an equally devastating one. The internet has made things more convenient, no doubt. But crossing over to the dark side of the World Wide Web and how predators and monsters are sitting on the other side of the screen, waiting to pounce on unsuspecting victims, it's a scary thought. These days, predators are more prevalent than ever, far more so than when this unfolded back in 2002. The thing I miss the most about the early days of the internet is that when you were done with it, you just turn it off and leave it where it was. If you found out your kids are using the internet irresponsibly, you could just take it away. These days, that's much more complicated, and in some situations, it's impossible. The main thing we all need to remember is that when you give a young kid or a teen a cell phone, a tablet, a laptop, a computer, whatever it is, you're not just giving your kid access to the internet. You're giving the internet access to your kid. Thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of True Crime Stories. I wanted to give a special thank you to a couple channel members, including Lonnie Meyer Sr. and Justin Berg. If you also want to become a member of the channel, you'll gain access to new videos sometimes days or weeks before they're uploaded to the public. And it's a great way to support the channel and help out. And I really appreciate those of you who have decided to do that. If you want to join, you can click that big join button below the video or find a link down in the description. And don't forget, True Crime Stories t-shirts are also now available. You can grab one of those from a link down in the description as well. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, check out this other interesting case I covered. And don't forget to subscribe. It's totally free and just keeps you up to date with all my future videos. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.